Hello everyone, my name is Nkosinathi Nama and I am a project coordinator for the Endangered Wildlife Trust in the People in Conservation program. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the webinar that was cut short on the 12th of May. The reason for this was because there was a power outage in the area that I live in, and as such there were problems with internet connectivity. If you have any questions about this webinar, please don't hesitate to send them through to me on my email address at nkosinathn@ewt.org.za. That email address will also be at the end of this presentation. So today I'll be talking to you about communities as custodians of catchments, the important role that they play, and why they are such a valuable stakeholder in conserving catchment areas. So communities as custodians of catchment areas, as people we all rely on our catchment areas for water provision. And so it is important that downstream communities as well as upstream communities play an active role in ensuring that these catchment areas are protected. The reason for that is simple. It's water. Water is a fundamental resource for each and every one of us, and water provision is on the top end of the list for any government in the world. Water is important for our wildlife, it's important for our plant life, and it's important for us as humans, for our survival, and also our economic activities. We all form part of various ecosystems, but these ecosystems would collapse if water provision was not there. As humans, our industries rely on water, and so these industries drive our healthcare, they drive our livelihoods, and also our agricultural activities as well. And so it is important that water is protected as a resource, and the infrastructure, or rather the ecological infrastructure that provides us with water, is protected. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the water cycle. The diagram here gives you a very simplified version of what that would look like, and this basically gives us an idea of the water journey. We'd start with precipitation, and that precipitation would flow through to our ecological infrastructure, and within our ecological infrastructure as people we've built dams, and we have pipes that transport the water from those dams to our various cities, towns, villages, and that's called built infrastructure. And from that built infrastructure, the water that has been collected then flows through to our taps. So a lot of the work that has been done around water is around built infrastructure, and that's because built infrastructure is the part that we as humans can really control. We build dams to store water, and we have pipes to transport that water. And so a lot of attention is focused on how efficiently and how sustainably our built infrastructure can get water to our various communities. However, built infrastructure is not the first line of defense in ensuring water provision. If you remember the previous diagram, the first line of defense is ecological infrastructure. In a country like South Africa, built infrastructure has received a lot of attention. And this is because in the past decade or so, our municipalities have been struggling to maintain our built infrastructure for water provision. And so media has really been highlighting that there's been this slow degradation of our built infrastructure, especially in our smaller towns. As I mentioned before, built infrastructure is important, but it is not the first line of defense in water provision. The first line of defense is our ecological infrastructure. Ecological infrastructure includes our catchment areas, it includes our ecosystems, and it includes the distribution channels that ensure that that water gets to our built infrastructure. And so the distribution channels would include rivers, wetlands, as well as underground channels like aquifers. Our ecosystems, of course, would be our plants and our wildlife, and then the catchment area would be the landscape in which we find these ecosystems. And so it's very important that the ecological infrastructure is well maintained so that it functions properly, so that it can feed the required water into the built infrastructure. If this is not maintained, it can have bad effects on the built infrastructure. infrastructure. So what is a catchment area? The two diagrams here give us basic illustrations of how a catchment area functions and what a catchment area would look like on a landscape level. The diagram on the left is what a catchment area would look like on a landscape level. So a catchment area would be a large tract of land where water falls and collects. And then as it collects, it is then transported to a network of streams and rivers, which then allow it to flow downstream for ecosystems as well as people to use. The picture on the right is just supposed to give you an idea of how a catchment would work. So if you take that house there, it has a roof, and that roof would represent the large area where the water would collect. That water is then transported down to the gutter system, which would represent the river and stream network that transports the water. The storage reservoir would represent the built infrastructure, and that infrastructure is what we use to store the water. And in the real world, or in the landscape level, that would be our dams and so on. A very important catchment area in South Africa would be the Drakensberg mountain area. The Drakensberg mountain area is a tourism hotspot and a biodiversity center, but it also provides water for urban centers such as Durban as well as Johannesburg. And so this mountainous area is the catchment area that collects the water, and within that catchment area are various streams and rivers that transport the water to our various built infrastructure. The Drakensberg mountain area is located on the east side of the country and is very important to South Africa for economic development, as it provides the economic hub of the country, Gauteng, with the water that it needs. Our catchment areas are very important for water security. If our catchment areas do not function properly, and if the catchment areas are degraded, then water security is threatened. South Africa is one of 30 driest countries in the world, and so water security here is high priority. In an effort to ensure water security for future generations, the government, as well as various research institutions in the country, identified what they called strategic water source areas. 22 of these areas were identified. And what these areas are essentially areas where there is a significantly higher amount of rainfall than other areas in the country. These areas are very important. They cover only 8% of the country's land surface area, but contribute more than 51% of the country's surface water budget. More than that, these areas drive about 64% of the country's economy. And so it is very important that these areas are protected and that these areas function in a proper manner and a proper way. As I said to you before, our strategic water source areas provide important water provision for urban centers. Cape Town depends on them, as well as Johannesburg, which is the financial and economic hub of the country, depend on these areas. Various threats face our strategic water source areas as South Africans. There are direct and indirect human threats. Indirect human threats include climate change, invasive alien plant species, and soil erosion. Climate change is an overarching threat and is very important to highlight. South Africa now experiences quite long drought seasons and very short but intense rainy seasons. And so this affects the way in which we use water and in which water is available to us. Direct human threats include things like land transformation, pollution, mining, and more recently, fracking. These areas affect our catchment areas directly and can cause various harm to these catchment areas. The work that the EWT does in these strategic water source areas is primarily based around the protection of species. And through the protection of species, the habitats that these species are found in are protected, And ultimately, hopefully, this would have knock-on effects. Now, the EWT works in a number of strategic water source areas, but a lot of the work that we do is in these 3 strategic water source areas, which is the Drakensberg, the Amathole, and the Soutpansberg. In the Drakensberg, a lot of the work is done around cranes and their habitats. In the Amathole, a lot of the work is done around the aquatic species found in that area. And in the Soutpansberg, a lot of the work is done around habitat protection. So the Amathole area is the area that I work in. I'm a project coordinator there for the endangered species project, and so I will be zooming in onto the Amathole area for the work that we do as an example. Before I do that, I would like to highlight the fact that communities are an important part of the work that we do. In all of our projects, it is inevitable that we will engage with the local communities in the area, whether it be commercial farmers, whether it be rural or peri-urban communities. However, we will interact with the local communities. And this is important because without the buy-in and the participation of the communities, the work around protecting our strategic water source areas would not be possible. We can never divorce communities from our catchment areas because communities live within those catchment areas, and so they have direct impact on those catchment areas. And so we need to work with them so that the impacts that they have are positive impacts, but also that communities that live in those catchment areas actually benefit from those catchment areas. This is the Amathole catchment area. Stunning scenery of mountains and some of the oldest indigenous forests in the country. This area is really a must visit for any tourist. But there is also an important function that the Amathole catchment area plays. It is a strategic water source area and is important for water provision in the Eastern Cape. The Amathole catchment area harbors a number of interesting species. The Cape parrot is South Africa's only indigenous parrot. It also has a number of aquatic species such as the Eastern Cape brockie, the border bob, the Amathole toad, the Amathole malachite, and the hartsback chirping frog. The Amathole toad is probably one of the most endangered species, amphibian species, in the country. It has only been sighted probably less than 10 times in the last 10 years, and I stand to be corrected on those numbers, but it's around that number. In the work that we do in the Amathole, these are the species that we focus on: the Amathole toad, the Eastern Cape brockie, and the border bob. The Amathole toad, as I mentioned before, is one of the most endangered amphibians in the country. It's found on the Afromontane grasslands of the catchment area, where it is faced by a number of threats, such as forestry as well as farming activities. The Eastern Cape brockies and the border bob are found in the river systems of the Amathole catchment area, specifically the Nkosinathi river system. They face a number of threats, such as invasive alien plant species as well as invasive alien fish species. The approach that we take in the project is based on these 3 spheres: communities drive conservation and improved livelihoods. By engaging with communities and understanding what their issues are, we can then endeavor to try and improve their livelihoods and also allow them to drive conservation in the area of interest. These 3 spheres are very important in the work that we do because they allow us to be targeted and they allow us to be more precise and efficient in the work that we do. And the work that we do is to protect those species so that we can protect our catchments. And so we need to ensure that the communities that we work with know exactly why we are doing what we are doing so that they can be a part of the work that we do. In our engagement process with communities, these key areas of implementation were identified: invasive alien plant species clearing. Invasive alien plants were a big problem for communities as it reduced the productivity of their grazing lands. Robust aquatic habitat species and endangered species monitoring was important for the Trust, as it ensured that the work that was being done around the catchment area actually would have the desired effects on the endangered species populations. The diversification of livelihoods was to ensure that communities could actually diversify livelihoods and therefore building resilience within these communities financially. Many of these communities are peri-urban or rural communities that have poor access to economic opportunities or skills development. And so this played a major component in ensuring that these communities would be able to support themselves moving forward. Strengthening institutions and partnerships. This allowed us to engage all stakeholders, government departments, municipalities, other NGOs that work within the catchment area, as well as local community structures. Get all these stakeholders together, sit them down, and talk about the future of the catchment, sustainability, and the challenges that face the catchment area moving forward. Much of the work that was undertaken by the Endangered Wildlife Trust in the Amathole catchment was undertaken in a quaternary catchment known as the TYUME Valley. Within the TYUME Valley flows the TYUME River system, and this system is important because it harbors the two endangered fish species that were mentioned before, the border barb and the eastern Cape Rocky. This river harbors active breeding populations of these species. The diagram on your right shows the various monitoring sites that were set up to ensure that the populations of these species were monitored. The river system faced a number of threats. There were communities who are living alongside the river, but also the invasive alien plant species that were threatening or that posed a threat to the river system. And the diagram on your left, that dark green over there, shows you the different areas in which we could find the invasive alien plant species. The primary invader here was black wattle or Acacia mayenzii, which was primarily found in the grassland areas and the riparian zones of the river. In the river itself, the invasive alien fish species, rainbow trout or Oncahanchus mycis, can be found in the river system. And this is important because this fish preys on the smaller indigenous fish that are found in the river. The Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries was approached, and they were approached to fund the project in the TYUME Valley. Through their Natural Resource Management Program, the department agreed to fund an alien invasive plant clearing project that would be coordinated by the Endangered Wildlife Trust, as well as co-founded by other funders that were approached by the Trust, which include Rand Merchant Bank. Through this project, 1,252 hectares of invasive alien plants were cleared, and 155 jobs were created for the local communities. And this 155 jobs is part of that diversification of livelihoods so that communities could be more resilient, but also communities could gain the skills needed in ensuring that they could continue the work of clearing invasive alien plants in future. The 1,252 hectares of invasive alien plants that were cleared were primarily along the riparian areas, and this has a significant effect on the indigenous fish populations in the area. But not only that, it has significant effects on the water flow of the river system. Black wattle is a big user of water and is a big problem in South African catchments. And so there's a massive drive to ensure that as many stands of this plant are removed in the country's catchment areas. These pictures are just an illustration or example of the work that was done in the catchment area. Much of the plant clearing work was done through ring barking, and this was because it was agreed that herbicides would not be used in the catchment area and the fear that these would then flow into the river system and then flow into the aquatic ecosystems. On the right there are just pictures of some of our some of the community members going to work to remove invasive alien plant. Diversification of livelihoods was also a major part of the project, and one of the ways it was agreed this could be done was through beekeeping. Beekeeping is a very lucrative business in South Africa, as the country has an oversupply of, an over demand for a high demand for honey, but the supply cannot meet that demand. And so 8 beekeepers in the TYUME Valley were trained in beekeeping, and they were trained and mentored by a professional beekeeper, and then various equipment was then donated to them so that they could start their beekeeping enterprises. And the idea here is that these entrepreneurs would grow to such an extent that they would be able to grow some kind of value chain in the communities that they live in, which would then support other families in the community. As I mentioned before, there were 32 monitoring sites along the TYUME River, and these sites were monitored for water quality, water quantity, as well as the indigenous fish species populations. During the fish population monitoring, invasive fish species were removed from the system. These species included rainbow trout as well as largemouth bass. A lot of the work that was done again was through the strengthening of institutions, and this was done through the Amathole Catchment Forum. The forum is a platform for all the stakeholders who are involved in the catchment to come together and discuss various challenges that face the catchment area. All stakeholders include the communities that live within the catchment area, as well as municipalities, national government departments, provincial government departments, and other NGOs, as well as irrigation boards. And so this platform is really some sort of coordination platform for the work that happens in the Amathole catchment area. The Catchment Forum has quarterly newsletters and meets on a biannual basis to discuss the various challenges and what the way forward would be regarding those challenges. The project also had indirect benefits. Indirect benefits included skills development. As I mentioned in the beginning, many of these communities have poor access to skills development opportunities, and that leads to poor access to economic opportunities. And so through the project, the teams that perform the invasive alien plant clearing work, some of them were skilled in first aid skills, as well as health and safety skills. Some of them were trained as peer educators, and some of them were trained as chainsaw operators. And these are skills that they can then take forward into other employment opportunities. And of course, there were the 8 beekeepers that were trained, and many of the teams that we worked with also received basic financial management training. And this was to ensure that whatever little income they had, they could use in a sustainable and responsible manner, and this builds the resilience in the communities that I was talking about earlier. Other indirect benefits were the supporting of small enterprises, such as catering enterprises. The teams, when they needed to be trained, the training would take the whole day, and so they needed to be catered for. And so the local ladies would then provide the catering for the training days, catering the lunch and the tea and coffee for during those training sessions. Other indirect benefits included a local school receiving a compost toilet, and this was done in partnership with Engineers Without Borders. And this was basically a pilot site for a compost toilet to see how it would work in a school environment, as many of the schools there have pit latrines as toilets. Another indirect benefit was the improved grazing capacity due to the removal of the invasive alien plant species, herbaceous cover grew back, and cattle were then had a larger area to graze. And so in the work that the Trust has done in the Amathole catchment, we have found that communities form a large part of the project. Community engagement is part of the project, but also without the members of the community, the project would not be possible. The conservation work follows the community engagement and really is dependent on the community engagement. Without that engagement with communities, the conservation work would not be important. And so in engaging with communities, you also need to take into account the challenges that they face, which are most of the time livelihood challenges. And so communities are custodians of our catchment areas, and they should be capacitated to ensure that they maintain these catchment areas and that they ensure that these catchment areas function properly, not only for them, but for the benefit of downstream users. Downstream users, in turn, need to ensure that they use the water that they receive responsibly and that they support the work that upstream communities do for the protection of the catchment areas. It's a game of many stakeholders, and the game can only be won if all partners pull together and ensure that an end goal is reached. And so at the end of this presentation, I'd like to say thank you for your time. And once again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send them through to me at nkosinathien@ewt.org.za. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the project, Rand Merchant Bank and the European Union, and other partners that were shown in this presentation for their participation in the project. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you have a great week ahead.